Hi everyone, I'm CJ Bedford, Chief People Officer at Eton Bridge Partners, and today I'm delighted to host the next in our podcast series, Inclusion Matters. And today we're going to be talking about impact and inclusion. We are incredibly lucky as an executive search, interim management and consulting business to engage with a wide range of different clients and candidates. I'm involved personally in our engagement with DE&I at Eton Bridge. So we're focused on ensuring that we build an inclusive culture, have a diverse workforce, but we also develop services for our clients that ensure that they're getting the diverse candidates that they need to bring the best talent into their business. And this is linked with our purpose, to put talented people at the heart of business. Today, we'll be joined by two people from our network who come from different backgrounds and different views on diversity and inclusion. Michelle will be sharing her experiences of being a Chief People Officer in a PLC organisation and how she's developing ED&I strategies. And Simon will share his experience of a long career engaging with organisations and supporting them to build their strategies from the outside in. We're looking forward to an interesting conversation, and I'm delighted to welcome Michelle and Simon to talk to us. Michelle, I'd love to hear about your background, your career, and why DE&I is important to you.
Sure. Hi everyone. So I'm Michelle Boothroyd. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this very important subject. So I have been in HR for all of my career, and originally from the northeast, from Newcastle, and started my career in a number of public sector organisations in the northeast. I then moved down to London and took up a number of roles in financial services, so working for RBS, Santander and Nationwide Building Society. And currently I'm the Chief People Officer at Grainger PLC, working in the real estate sector.
Great career.
Yes, very varied. But what I have seen throughout all of those sectors and organisations is different aspects and different initiatives all relating to ED&I. And more recently in my current role, it's been a core part of my focus and a core part of delivering our people strategy. The reason ED&I is important to me, if I take it from a personal perspective, first of all, is I think all of us at some point have experienced something which we can relate to equality, diversion and inclusion. And for me personally, I experienced that in the form of accent bias, which might not seem like something that's particularly prevalent, but I did experience it having a Geordie accent and moving outside of the northeast. And I can remember when it first happened and there was a few comments being a little bit surprised and taken back by it. So I guess, just being very aware that, we are all different, and what makes us different makes us unique. And my passion is around creating inclusive environments for everybody, where everybody can thrive and given that opportunity to.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. Great story to hear. Simon, we'd love to hear about your career and about some of the research that you've done recently around ensuring that DEI initiatives add real purposeful value to organisations. Tell us a bit about that.
So I'm Simon Fanshawe, and I've never had a job, unlike you two very well qualified people. So I've been endlessly freelance, but now I have a consultancy called Diversity by Design, and there's a reason for that, which is that if you are going to genuinely make an impact, that's a split infinitive, but we'll live with it. If you're genuinely going to make an impact, then you need to change things as a result of what you've done around diversity. So that's why we call it Diversity by Design. And we work with anybody, actually disgracefully promiscuous in our pitching across all sectors and across all sizes, actually, really to find sort of emblematic ways, clients who really, really do want to make this a driving force for change in their talent. And we've been doing that for about 14 years. A couple of key experiences, I think, in relation to this awful anachronized thing now, DEI, ED&I, DEIB. Oh, drives me up the wall. There's two things I want to say about it, which I think are fundamental for me in terms, and my motivation. The first is really echoing something that you said and expanding on it, which is the only thing that human beings have got in common is that we're all different. We can't understand each other. I can't see the world in the way that you see it. When you tell that experience about coming down from the northeast, I can't see that. I can hear it, but I can't see it and experience it. But what I can do is listen. What I can do as another human being is to try and understand it, but only in the certain knowledge that I never will. That's why we bother with this. We bother with it because we don't understand each other, and we need constantly to be curious about each other in order, and this is my second point, to work together. Mm-hmm. The point about these things that have arisen, and they've got this long history, haven't they, through civil rights, and we can go right back to the Enlightenment if you want, but through civil rights and anti-discrimination work, and then it's flourished into this kind of peculiar thing now, which is a thing of its own. And it isn't a thing of its own. It's fundamentally about talent. Mm-hmm. It's about two things, I think, fundamentally about countering discrimination so that people don't experience a block to their talent for who they are. And the second thing is that once they get to rise to the level that they want to rise to. Not everybody wants to CEO, so they do that. So it's about those two things. It's about removing discrimination, it's about unleashing talent. So the research, hurrah.
Wonderful research.
This is based on a hunch, which is that what unfortunately happened, I thought, so we wanted to test this, and this is in conversations with sort of leaders, HR directors or chief execs or whoever. What I think had happened was that everybody had said, rah, rah, diversity and inclusion, yes, let's do that. So they give it to sort of HR or thereabouts and say, go and do it. And HR gets on and does what it does. But actually, in truth, what that did was it delinked it from core purpose. It made it a thing of its own. And what started to grow was this peculiar thing that had its own justification. So what the report tried to do was we interviewed in depth, a social researcher that we got, interviewed in depth people from the chair of BT and Babcock right the way through to a staff group in one of the utilities, water utilities. Mm-hmm. So up and down and across sectors. And what we wanted to find out was what's the state of the nation? And what we found out was that, yes, it has become delinked from purpose. So the core thing to start with, and that's my big message from this, is that if people are going to think about diversity and inclusion, they need to think about the deficits, as I call them, in other words, where discrimination tells. Then they need to think about the dividends, which is how the combination of that difference, once you've unleashed it, advances the core goals of the organisation. And that's the starting point for execs and boards. And until they do that, they won't be able to have a meaningful DEI, ID, whatever strategy, which drives the business. Yeah. And the just last point, the danger is if you don't have a ED&I, D&I, whatever strategy that drives the business, it then starts to be about performative things.
And that links into what we were talking about before the podcast, Michelle, around how you developed your ED&I strategy at Grainger and how you went about that, because linked to your purpose, linked to what you're looking to achieve with your business and engaging with your people from diverse backgrounds. Love to hear how you put that together.
Yeah, absolutely. So the starting point for us was our people strategy. So our people strategy in terms of what are the things that matter? How do we relate this, and how do our 4 company values underpin what we do and why we do it? So looking at it from a strategic perspective linked to the company goals, strategic objectives, the overarching people strategy was formed 3 years ago. And then coming from that, and I spent a lot of time speaking to colleagues in the organisation. It was perfectly timed because we were doing a colleague conference and we had sessions with colleagues asking what's important to them and forming the people strategy. So tell me, what would you like to see? What's going to help you in your career? And naturally coming out of that were actions, suggestions, initiatives that were ED&I focused. So it was very much looking at it holistically, getting some genuine feedback and not being squirreled away in a room and being devised by HR, because we could take the ideas back to what our colleagues told us. And then stemming from that, really working closely with our ED&I network was a very collaborative approach. So our network is well established. They're a really passionate, great bunch of colleagues, and we've got various different subgroups that focus on different elements. So working in tandem with the network in terms of their engagement events, if they were doing learning sessions, and seeing how does that fit as part of our broader strategic plan. In essence, the ED&I strategy has been wide-ranging, so it's covered everything from creating training that we previously didn't have in place on different subjects. It's looked at our internal proposition, so pay and provision, and our policies. And then we've also made better use of our data and insight. So what is it that colleagues are telling us, so we can then focus our initiatives or improvements or enhancements for the organisation. We've also looked externally as well. So how do we know our strategy is working? Have we got it right? How do we sit compared to our peer group? And I'll probably touch on that a little bit later in terms of how we made some of those measurements.
And look, coming up with that strategy in the first place isn't easy. I've only been at Eton Bridge for a year now. The first thing I did as I came in was to really get a sense of where the organisation was at from a broad engagement perspective, and focusing a part of that on how to what extent they felt included in the organisation, and to what extent they felt comfortable having conversations with our clients and candidates about D&I, because I think that's really important. Our purpose is to put talented people at the heart of business, so we've got to be able to have those conversations actively, and to be able to debate the subject, because not everybody has the same views. So we've done some work with our consultants to help them be much more comfortable having those conversations. But what I also noticed in the sector as a whole is that clients want diversity data to support their talent pipeline. So when they're receiving a shortlist from us, they want to get a sense of what the diversity of that shortlist is like. Now, having coming into the sector, this is the first time I've worked in exec search, noticed that our competitors, other businesses, had been identifying that data through looking at pictures on LinkedIn. So we've now put in a very different way of doing that, sort of a very human way of doing that, asking people if they're comfortable sharing their data, and then taking it in a conversation, following up with the GDPR on email, or say asking them to fill in a survey to bring that to life, so we can be sure that the data that we give our clients is real data. So we've done two clear things there internally, focusing on educating our consultants, engaging with our clients, and we've done broader stuff around engagement and connecting with our communities as well. But I think getting the understanding of where the organisation is and how that fits with purpose, I think, is really important. What have you seen, Simon, from the organisations that you've spoken to around how they've built strategies and how they've developed an approach that is purposeful?
Well, I spend most of my time going, why are you doing this?
Mhm.
I get kind of 5-year-old about it. They go, oh, because it's the right thing to do. I go, no, shut up. Why? And I just go on going, why? The moon's blue. Why is the moon blue? And the reason I do it is that if you, so I'll give you an example, and they're fine about me talking about this. We just worked with Severn Trent Water, and they brought together about 25 people, completely across the grades and the functions. So it was a really broad group. And I asked them, I put up the slide. Well, there's your 5 things you say you're going to do. And what kind of diversity would help me do that better? And we just worked on that for a day. And what came out of that session, a day's worth of talking and thinking and challenging, were 3 focuses. So they are a regional monopoly. Can't get your water from anywhere else, okay? So you don't get to choose them.
No options there.
So that means they feel strongly related to their region. They have that's part of how and who they are. So what came out of this was customers, community, and you have to alliterate, don't you? So competencies, because it's in the law, but skills. So if you look at that, so what it wasn't about was, it was not a diversity strategy based around minorities. Number one, what's crucial and what's interesting about their workforce is it immediately raises the challenge of how do you engage a group of people who go from senior execs or people who work in policy or people who work in HR to your bloke, and it will be 96-7% blokes on the street digging the hole, or whatever. So you've got a very wide range of people there you've got to engage. So once we'd started with that, the next question is, what does diversity mean? And the only way you can ask that question, you've got to decide what your baseline is.
Yeah.
So what I always say to people, I've got this thing, the deficits and the dividends, which I've mentioned before. So the first thing is you say, what are the deficits? And the only way you can understand a deficit is against a baseline, because otherwise the imbalance doesn't make any sense because you don't know what you're valuing. So if you look, for instance, at the pop, so it's legitimate, therefore, to say across their region, the demography of the region is a good baseline. So then you say, are we attracting all the people that we could attract aged 16 to 18 as apprentices from all the population groups in the region? Answer no. Question why? Why not? Therefore solution. So it makes actual sense to target some of their programs, as it turned out in that case, on women and ethnic minorities, because they are people to whose talent they could bring in and to whom they could offer opportunities. Contrast that with working with Said Business School, so the great famous business school in Oxford University. So they've got three groups of staff. They've got academics, they've got professional services staff, and they've got largely outsourced contract staff who do the catering, the cleaning and the gardening and all that. So each of those three groups of staff needs a very different answer to those sets of questions because they all have different baselines depending on where you recruit, what the contractual relationship is. So their baseline, I mean, they're in a global business school. What's their baseline? The world? Well, actually, no. It was a different baseline. And actually, we started to use the nationalities in the staff and the students and the alumni as a way of starting to understand that. Every diversity strategy that we work on with clients looks different. And people are always saying to me, what will it look like? And I said, well, I can't tell you because that's the point of the process. You operate in lots of different markets.
Yes.
So what you use as baselines is sensibly different, isn't it?
That's a really interesting point about the gender pay gap, Simon. How does that play out at Grainger PLC, Michelle?
We're very conscious about reflecting and serving our community because, as you mentioned before, we are throughout the UK and making sure that we are in tune with our customers. We've done a number of initiatives to support our female leaders. And one of the measures that we look at, which is an external measure, is the FTSE Women Leaders. So really proud that as an organisation, we've gone from 46th place to 19th in the past year.
Amazing change. We're super proud of that.
Yes, we are. We are led by a female CEO and we have good representation on our board and on our executive committee. We've also got a number of initiatives that we run that are aimed at supporting talent more broadly. And where we've seen really strong female participation are in our internal Grainger mentoring programme. So over 60% of our mentees are female in the programme. And we also ran a Future Leaders programme a couple of years ago. And again, we had more female leaders part of that programme.
Michelle, it'd be great to hear from Grainger's perspective of how your board, so non-execs, the executive team, how do they engage with the D&I and gender? And what, I suppose, advice do you give leaders in other organisations to help them navigate some of these tricky situations?
Yeah, so our board are absolutely engaged with the D&I agenda. We have one of our board committees called Responsible Business Committee, where ED&I is firmly on the agenda. So we table it in two ways. Firstly, myself and the chair of our ED&I network, we jointly present an update at the committee meeting, which actually gives a holistic view. So it covers what's happening from a strategic perspective, what's happening from an engagement perspective, and what's coming up. So the board get a really good feel for ED&I across the organisation. And then we also have what we call Voice of the Colleague. So the chair of RBC holds a couple of roundtable discussions every year, and it gives the board a different side of insight because they are confidential. It is the chair and a selection of colleagues from across the business in different roles, different locations, different tenure, and they will talk about culture and engagement. So the visibility that gives to the board and also then shared with our executive committee really gives us then an opportunity to test, are we doing the right thing? Are we missing something? And is there anything else that we need to consider? So our RBC and our board are a key part of our ED&I agenda. We talk about it as an executive committee. More recently, we did a session on inclusive leadership as an exco, which was fantastic. And some of those more personal stories came out. I think we all learned something new about each other that perhaps we didn't know before. But really then thinking about, how do we role model this? You know, how does inclusive leadership play out for us as an executive leadership team? We've tried and tested a number of different formats. So we've found storytelling works really well, where our environment is open and inclusive. So we have colleagues sharing their real life lived experience. We've done panel events, which again have been internally facilitated. Sometimes we've had external speakers, and again, you know, recognising key events. So International Women's Day is a great example. So we've had females in the organisation and men talking about what matters to celebrate it. So again, I think just making it authentic, making it feel real, and doing it in a way that resonates with people.
It's very difficult, I think. Boards and execs have a great difficulty, I think, in knowing how to be reported to. Because what typically people do, I think, is that it's easy to count sheep, but it's easy to count things that you can count. So that's my deficit bit of the agenda. So you do have to do that, but that's the easy bit in a way. And boards do that. I think, you know, you go, oh, we've got more women this year. And they go, hurrah, you know, less women this year, boo. And that's sort of where it stops. And I think the really interesting thing is, back to the question I was asking you, is how do you report on the outcomes that this strategy, which is essentially a people strategy, is underneath it all, it's a talent strategy. So what outcomes is it delivering, and how? I'm just developing a board tool, but it's not a series of prescriptions, it's a series of questions. What should you ask that'll take you through that thought process as a board, that will fulfill your responsibilities as a board, and also give you insight on which you can operate as a board, as leaders of the organisation. And I think that's one of the big missing things for me, is how we report on this stuff well.
And I think the quantitative on its own doesn't tell a story, and I think it's really good that there's active engagement from the board and speaking to people who are experiencing the organisation themselves and getting that qualitative feel about what's going on, not just looking at the numbers.
Absolutely.
How are you tracking and measuring the impact of some of the initiatives that you're working on, Shah?
So it's a combination of internal tracking and measurement, and also external. So internally, you know, a great sense check is our engagement survey. And we have a dedicated section in our survey that is all on ED&I. So we've got a really great benchmark around how are people feeling, and being able to measure that twice a year. We also ask colleagues to share their ED&I data with us on a voluntary basis. So that really helps us to understand the makeup of the organisation, but then the outcome is, well, what do we then deliver to make sure it's fit for purpose? So a great example of that is, we know over a quarter of those who completed the questionnaire have caring responsibilities. We are members of Carers UK, and that's important to us because we know we've got a good proportion of our workforce that value it. So that's some of the outcomes that it leads us to. From an external perspective, I've touched on some of the different benchmarks that are out there. More recently, we were accredited with the National Equality Standard, which is the leading benchmark in diversity, with EY. And that was a really rigorous process that spans across the whole of the business. It isn't just HR policies and practices, it's everything from supply chain, strategy, communication. And to achieve that gives us a great sense that the practices that we have been developing and implementing are actually leading practices. So we measure it in a number of different ways. I don't think you can focus on one particular source. I think you look at it holistically and then see what information that gives you.
And what's important is it's across an organisation, up and down, across the job families and so on and so forth. I mean, one of my absolute bugbears is so people use categories around data that are simply incoherent or meaningless. The point about data is you have to use data for a purpose to tell you something about a real group of people.
Yeah, there's a balance to be cut there,
There's an absolute
definitely.
balance.
So as we maybe start wrapping up some really interesting conversations, what are the 3 top things that organisations can do that to have an EDI strategy that has a real impact and an impact that matters? What are the kind of 3 key things that they should be thinking about?
Shall I go?
Go for it.
So it's got to be linked to the purpose
Michelle.
and the commercial purpose of the organisation in terms of why are we doing this. It has to be holistic, so it has to be part of the overarching people strategy, and it's got to be understood. So have you got your board and your leadership team on board? And do colleagues, does everybody understand why we're doing it? So it's the what, the how and the why.
Love that, Michelle.
Absolutely, to reflect that. If you can't answer the question, why and what kind of diversity at different levels and in different functions of our organisation is going to deliver better outcomes for our mission, then you're not in the right place in the first place. The second thing I would say, I find this division between deficits and dividends very handy, because people tend to talk about diversity in terms of the deficits. Well, there are deficits. It's absolutely crucial to understand them. So I ask 3 questions. Why do they matter? And that's the baseline question. Secondly, what is actually causing them? And thirdly, what can your company do about them? Because sometimes the solution is not yours, it's way outside. So that's the second thing, deficits and dividends. And the dividend question is the answer to the first question, which is the why you're doing it. And then I would say on this data question is be clear about the categories and what they're telling you. And the last thing I would say is think very, very seriously about what you're doing when you set up staff networks, because they can either become activists or they become grumble hubs.
I would add to that and sort of echoing both of your thoughts. But for me, definitely linking it to purpose and the outcomes of what you do as an organisation. So for us, it's around talent and bringing the best people for our clients and making sure that that is valuable talent that is going to grow in their business as well. So focusing on that impact. I think measurement's got to happen. In some ways, you've got to be able to prove that whatever you're doing is adding value, whether that's increasing diversity or having employee engagement impact, talent pipeline impact. And I think for me, ensuring that your initiatives are inclusive, that they are bringing the vast majority of people along, and thinking about building holistic inclusion in your organisation rather than necessarily driving it down identity groups. Because for me, and we talked about this at the beginning, to me, everybody's got a story, everybody's got a way that they come to work and barriers that they might feel they face. So let's ensure that we're breaking down all of those barriers and creating that space in organisations. Thank you both so much for a really interesting, challenging and active conversation. It's been wonderful to speak to you. We will be putting this pod and videocast, so you get this in 360 out to share with our clients and candidates and to ensure that we're giving people in organisations the advice they need to make the right decisions. Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Michelle and Simon for taking the time to speak to me today. It's been a really interesting discussion and really appreciating hearing different perspectives and different experiences about building purposeful D&I strategies. To hear more of our insights and interviews with senior leaders, you can subscribe to the Eton Bridge podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or you can watch the full interview on YouTube. Keep in touch with us via our LinkedIn page to hear about regular news, insights and events.